This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. In this episode of Roots and All, I'm joined by Joshua Sparks of Birch Farm, a grower whose innovative soil-centred approach blends regenerative principles with a deep reverence for the natural world. We dig into his unique style of farming, how it's shaped by observation and experimentation, and why it offers a glimpse into what must be the future of sustainable food production.
So I am the head gardener, head grower, however you want to put it, really, for a market garden in North Devon, in a village called Wolseley. It's part of this thing called the Collective at Wolseley, and we're basically a group of businesses that all basically are there to supply each other. So we have a pub called the Farmer's Arms, we have a fish shop, we have a shop, we have rooms to rent, and I manage basically the vegetable fruit production for that. So I'm very lucky in the sense that I have a guaranteed buyer to buy the vegetables and the crops and the fruits, which comes in the form of the shop, the pub and the fish shop. And then vice versa, they have interesting things to put on the menu. But I was very fortunate in my position that when I came on, basically the farm was just a field and we got to start from scratch, literally the ground up. And we used that opportunity because I had just come back from Japan. So I'd worked in Japan looking at horticulture and natural farming. I've been to America to look at regenerative agriculture and horticulture. And really what I wanted to do was create a natural farming system and what that looked like. And, I was very fortunate to find this position that allowed me to do that.
Two questions. How big is the site and how long have you been growing on it?
Yeah, so the farm in total is 180 acres, but I manage about 25 acres of that. So my food growing site is 17 acres, but I also manage a 5-acre woodland and a couple of acres of meadow here and there. So really my area is that kind of like big chunk of 17 acres. And I've been there 5 years now. This is my 5th year.
So that is a huge chunk of land. I'm guessing that part of your plan when you took it over and as you go on managing it is to maybe reduce the kind of labour involved in it. Am I right in thinking that?
Well, we went in with 2 ideas, to be honest. So one, we wanted a farming system that relied on basically no inputs or minimal inputs as much as possible. And so that's so we could keep our food at an affordable price for everyone. And so we don't use compost, we don't use wood chip, we don't use any inputs like that. All fertility has to come from the farm. And because of that, that means our input cost is drastically lower than a lot of other places. So we start, I hate talking in monetary terms, but it does mean that we start to make money from our crops quicker because we don't have that input cost. I really wanted a more full-time team and a permanent team. So we don't use seasonals and instead we invest in a smaller team, but a team that stays on for most of the year. And so we can keep them on in winter as well. But the idea is as the guys kind of phase out and move on to better things, maybe we find that we don't have to fill those positions because the farm has taken a direction of a lot more perennial agriculture, both agroforestry and perennial vegetables.
You mentioned perennial vegetables. I'm thinking, is there kind of an initial investment involved in planting those?
Yeah, so we couldn't afford to buy all the perennial vegetables because they come at the same price of like garden perennials. So when you're talking like £8 a plant, it gets a bit scary. So what we've done is we've built a little nursery this year, like a tiny, tiny little nursery. We're growing predominantly a lot of it from root cuttings and seeds. But perennial veg, long term, you get something that comes back every year. They don't require irrigation because they're so deep rooted, they're more climate resilient, but there's definitely that initial startup cost where you have to either buy the plants, buy the seeds, and it takes about 2 years for them to bulk. We're still using an annual system now while our perennials bulk up and we can pick them.
So when you say as well the food forest, I'm guessing that involves trees.
Yeah, so it's basically a 7-layer system that involves trees, woodies, and those woodies include things like shrubs. We also have system trees within that, so that's trees that can either cultivate for us, as in they're really deep-rooted, or they're nitrogen-fixing trees, which fix the nitrogen. And I think an element we can add into that is carbon sequestration trees. And really what I mean by that is like pioneers. So things like birch, alnus, willow, and we can use them to generate loads of photosynthesis, and that locks in more carbon, which builds the fertility of the forest. And then below that, there are more things like herbaceous herbs, root crops, and those root crops can include things like Jerusalem artichoke. So I guess there are a few herbaceous things at the bottom as well. I think food forest is a little bit deceiving. Really, what we're trying to create is like a food woodland edge. So we still let enough light in that we can get a lot of fruiting crops, but we still have a nice kind of like woodland canopy on top of that as well that kind of mimics a little bit of an edge of a forest.
I'm probably going to ask you loads of daft questions because I don't think I've ever been to a food forest at scale. And I'm guessing the one that you're establishing is fairly large. If you were to have this kind of varying levels of crops and varying kind of incidences of crops throughout the site, does it then become quite difficult to harvest, for example?
Yeah, so we have two food forests. We have a 2.5 acre, which I dub the romantic food forest. So that food forest is very much like a Martin Crawford food forest or a Robert E. Hart, who are two really like big food forest pioneers. But by romantic, I mean they're quite beautiful, but you sacrifice efficiency in harvesting. So when we start to mix up all these fruit trees and dot them around in random locations, I could send someone off, we could lose them for a few days and we have to go find them. But what we're developing now is we have another food forest, which is 10 acres. And that's inspired by another forest farmer called Wouter van Eck in the Netherlands. And he's been developing agricultural food forests. And so what an agricultural food forest is we sacrifice a little bit of the beauty and we add efficiency into the system. So trees are more lined in rows of varieties and they make it a much more efficient. But an agricultural food forest shares exactly the same philosophy of nature, biodiversity, habitat, and climate resilience as a more traditional food forest.
So going back to the perennial veg, because that I think is something that people are experimenting with, but it's still not that well known. What kind of things are you growing that are perennial?
We're growing, the kind of classics. So we have a few varieties of perennial kales, which are really good at filling the hunger gap. So like right now, our annual kales are going quite fibrous and bitter, but actually the perennial kale is still really fresh and delicious. Another good one is sea kale. So sea kale you can force and get the lovely nutty shoots that we're used to. But actually right at this time, you get a really delicious broccoli or PSB alternative. Other ones that we're really liking are 9 Star broccoli, which is the cauliflower slash kind of white PSB. Good King Henry, but not for the leaf. Anyone who's eating Good King Henry is a bit of a stark wake up call when you eat it because it's so bitter. But actually, what's really delicious on Good King Henry is the shoot, is the flowering shoot. It's dubbed poor man's asparagus, but it's a really delicious asparagus alternative. And that's really interesting when we think that we can grow Good King Henry in like deep shade as well. So we could have instead of just having asparagus, we could have a big mixture. We're also eating things like forced hosta shoots, Solomon seal. Solomon seal is actually a really delicious perennial edible. Sedums, Hemeracalis, Triscantias. Another few interesting ones are like the Corsican spinach, the Halbitsia tamnoides. It's got these lovely red shoots, which you can harvest again like asparagus, which then turn into really good spinach leaves. Grows in full shade again, and it's a climber, so we can grow it vertical to use it for more space. Mashua is a really good one for us as well. It's a good wasabi alternative when we ferment it. And yeah, just lots and lots and lots of different things. Apios americana, which is a delicious root crop, which we're really excited as an alternative to potato. And it's got this lovely potato, kind of like potato hazelnut flavor to it. And it actually has more fiber, more protein, and full of loads of essential vitamins that potatoes don't have. So what we're finding is a lot of these perennials are really, really good for us as well.
And how are the kitchen finding cooking with them?
Yeah. So they're really good. So Toby, the head chef's really good. So he'll take these things and he'll put them into dishes. And it's only going to work with the help of the chefs. That's kind of like crucial for this. So we need the chefs to take those perennial foods and turn them into really delicious things. So like a good example is, so Toby put venison on the menu. So we need to cull around 2 million venison a year for the UK to return back to a shrubland, which is really important for like bird diversity and wildlife. And so we had venison on the dish, and then we had roasted or char grilled mashua root. And then Toby took the mashua and also grated it and fermented it and had it as a wasabi replacement, along with blackberries that we harvested from the farm. So there was like blackberries and mashua, and everything on the dish was either wild or perennial.
I bet they absolutely love it when you come in with this new thing that you've found and go, right, what can you do with this?
And like I said, instead of just giving him a bundle of asparagus, what we can give him is a bundle of Force Hosta, Solomon Seal, Good King Henry, asparagus, and like epilobium. So we can diversify what we give to the chef. So it's a lot more interesting for them.
And I'm guessing, obviously, if you're planting annual crops, they might be fertilizer heavy, but I'm guessing you still need to feed your perennial crops. How do you go about that?
Yeah. So, from the beginning, we never wanted a kind of traditional no dig system, I guess. We didn't want to create a market garden that relied on us having to buy compost every single year. Not personally a massive supporter of council composts, which are the only affordable compost that we can use, just because of the plastic contamination in them. And so, like I said, we don't use any compost, we don't use any wood chip. But what we do on the farm is we use a natural farming technique where we basically grow with weeds and we rely on root diversity to maximize soil fertility. How we generate fertility is by having a massive diversity of roots: deep roots, lateral, shallow, fibrous, tap, everything. And for us, how we can do that is by using a lot of weeds. So what we generally have is we have our perennial veg and we manage it through sickling. So if the weeds are getting a bit too crazy, we'll sickle it and we'll chop and drop those weeds. They build a mulch on the ground. And then by the time the perennial crops are big enough, they kind of like start suppressing the weeds themselves, and the weeds growing in a much more lethargic, kind of relaxed kind of way, that they're not a problem anymore. And so again, that's how we generate it. And actually, that's a lesson that we've learned from our agroforestry. So we also practice something called syntropic agriculture, or we're inspired by syntropic agriculture. And syntropic is an agroforestry farming style from a chap called Ernest Gosch. And it's basically we plant trees in very close succession. So trees are almost 50 centimeters to a meter apart. They have lots of different root diversity again. And through like us managing the system by pruning it and having trees in close parameters, it builds up huge amounts of fertility and photosynthesis through like carbon sequestration again. And I think this idea of competition is redundant now. I don't believe in it at all. Actually, what I'm finding is a lot of plants, whether they're trees or perennial vegetables or vegetables annual, they all grow as a community, and they actually like having diversity within that community.
I think some people might assume that if you are letting the weeds grow and kind of use the nutrients that your perennial plants might need, that might be a problem. But I'm assuming you're saying that that's not the case.
Since we started the farm, I have never seen, and that's both perennial and annual and trees and whatever, I've never seen a situation where something has taken from something else. I mean, the only caveat to that is grass. Like, I will admit grass can be a problem. But if you take grass out of the equation, which is something we're always trying to stop anyway, nothing else I've seen do that. And we've noticed that our fertility has gone up and up and up and up on the farm, that we don't worry about it at all anymore.
And you mentioned soil inoculants as well. How do you incorporate that practice?
Yeah, so we practice a few techniques, but the main one that we do is KNF. So that term is Korean natural farming. It's created by a chap called Master Cho. And basically what we do is we make soil inoculants through fermentation. So we make a fish amino acid. So we'll take all the old fish head and guts from the pub, bring it up, and we'll ferment that and turn that into a really powerful inoculant. It's really high in nitrogen, but we don't really care about that. Actually, what it's full of is fats and polysaccharides and proteins that the soil microbes devour and love. We also make things like water-soluble calcium from old eggshells or mussel shells. We ferment seawater because seawater has every single trace mineral that we require. And so we do like fermented seawater. And then the two big ones for us are LAB, which is lactobacillus. So LAB is basically we take a carbohydrate like grain, we put it in some water for 7 days and leave it in the field. When that water smells quite sweet, we know we've captured the lactobacillus in the air. And then we'll add some milk. And we'll actually use milk from our shop that's gone past its sell by date. So it's a way to recycle the milk. We'll add some milk, a curd will form, and then that liquid from the curd is basically lactobacillus. And then we can use that LAB to either ferment food waste, so bokashi. So bokashi composting, the brand and the formula EM is basically lactobacillus, but you can make it at home for nothing, basically. And we can use that to ferment food waste or garden waste, or we can use it as a soil cleanser or plant cleanser in the sense that LAB is quite good at not fully stopping, but it's quite good at slowing down things like potato blight and powdery mildew. And then the other big one that we do is IMO. So IMO stands for Indigenous Microorganisms. Sounds a bit witchy, but what we'll do is we'll have a box made from oak. We fill it with part cooked rice, like al dente rice. We'll take that into the woods. We'll bury it under the healthiest tree that we can find. We'll come back a few days later. The rice will turn into this big, white, fuzzy mass. I call it an IMO cake that you can pull the whole rice out, finger and thumb. And then we'll do 4 different stages that will grow those microorganisms caught on the rice until we have one ginormous fermented pile. And then we can use that to inoculate the soil on the farm, and potting mix as well. We actually use a lot of it in our potting mix now.
Yeah, I mean, you said it sounds a bit witchy. Some of it does, admittedly. Is it difficult to get buy-in from some of the other people that you work with or the other stakeholders on the farm?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes when we start, I mean, the whole idea of natural farming, like when we started, it was like, that won't work. You can't grow with weeds. You know, every single day it was like, that won't work, that won't work. But I think actually what's happened is over time is that people have seen this huge abundance on the farm. And actually everyone's kind of jumped on board with it now. Everyone's really supportive of it. We now run workshops on it as well to teach people as much as possible. And I think actually what's happened is everyone who's joined the farm and the guys have really latched onto it because they've seen firsthand how healthy the farm's become.
So I'm guessing your soil is super healthy and full of biodiversity. How about the kind of above soil environment? Is that also thriving?
Yeah, I mean, our soil is beautiful. I mean, it smells sweet, it retains moisture. It's always got a tilth. It's lovely and crumbly. So all of our vegetables, whether it's perennial or annual, is grown as a polyculture. And so by polyculture, you know, we grow multiple different vegetable families in one bed. So we aim for 5, basically. But then when you add the weeds into that, the weeds can add another like 10 or 15 genus or species into that. So one bed can have up to 15 to 20 different types of plant growing at one time. And then how we plan our polyculture is again looking at our forestry is we plan it in canopy layers. So we have a low canopy, medium, high, so on and so on. But what that does is the bed becomes this kind of like explosive wilderness in its own right. And then the weeds are pollinating. You know, weeds are the greatest pollinators we have. They're better than any annual or cover crop because a lot of the weeds have evolved with the insects to pollinate them within our areas. So we get huge amounts of pollination. We get loads of birds that use the beds as like cover. They actively hunt the slugs for us. And we're just finding the beds are like these little tiny micro forests as they are. So we get loads of biodiversity above ground. Lots of snakes, lots of newts, toads, lizards, hedgehogs. They all live within the vegetable beds.
Amazing. And you mentioned things like powdery mildew. I'm assuming you find things are more resistant to animal attack as well as disease attack?
Yeah, I mean, you know, when we first started, I won't be around the bush, like slugs were a real problem for us. When we took it from a dairy pasture into a natural farming system, that first year, we were picking about 2 kilos of slugs off one veg bed at a time. Never seen as many slugs as that in my entire career. But then what happened was, very quickly, is that by making the farm quite wild, the predators started to come back. And a lot of the predators on slugs actually share slug habitat. So when we remove all this slug habitat constantly, we're actually removing predator habitat at the same time. And the one predator that we want is beetles. I always joke that I think we're beetle farmers rather than vegetable farmers because a lot of what we do is actually to encourage beetles. And then since we've done that, you know, slug populations, or I don't know how you want to put it really, I don't know if control, whatever, they've dropped massively, that we don't really have slug problems anymore. And that includes things like cabbage root fly, carrot root fly, we just don't really get those problems like we used to in the beginning, because I think there's so many predators now just eating all these kind of like undesirables that we have on the farm. But equally, we want slugs on the farm, because by having slugs on the farm, we're feeding our predators, and we're keeping them on site as well. Being too tenacious in hunting them can also lead to the predators going somewhere else. But overall, we're noticing a huge decline in pest pressure. Like, we have rabbits on the farm. They don't do anything to the vegetable field. I don't know why, to be fair. People always ask me what the secret is. I don't know. But I do wonder, is it because they just have so much food they can eat that, and they'd rather eat that than our vegetables?
So I suppose you've kind of got this system established, and that leads me on to the question, is there a minimum area that you think this would work on?
I mean, one thing that holds the farm back a little bit is that we're surrounded by conventional agriculture. And so the farm is basically like this little mini oasis. And so I think personally the farm could be a lot more biodiverse if we had neighboring forest or farms to bring in more biodiversity, but we don't. So the farm's quite static. So I think size-wise, you can do it at any space or size. I think the real thing that can let it down is if you don't have those connections to surrounding kind of like biodiversity. But that's not to say not to do it. You know, I do it in my little garden, you know, and it's working quite well. So I think you could do it from allotment up. The problem is if you're doing it from an allotment and you start growing with weeds, then you start getting those pesky letters, and people don't need to cut it down and stuff.
Yeah, quite. So you're always trialing new things. It sounds all very exciting. Is there anything in particular that you've got on the horizon that you're very excited about exploring?
Yes. So the next exciting thing is, because our perennials and agroforestry has been working so well, the idea is to start to phase out more annual production. We'll never get rid of annuals, you know, we don't want to, because annuals are delicious as well. You know, broad beans and courgettes and beans and stuff like that are some of my favorite crops. You know, I don't want to stop that. What we want to do is use perennials to fill the hunger gap, so we don't have to rely so much on like things like polytunnels and fleeces that we don't have anyway. But we're finding that the perennials are really good at filling that gap before kind of like mid-May, when the annuals grow really well outside. So I'm really excited that we're going to add a lot more perennials. But what I'm particularly excited for is that, like I said, we're very inspired by this idea of syntropic agriculture, which is this idea of planting trees very close together. And what we're doing now is our produce field is 1.5 to 2 acres. And actually, what we're doing is we're planting mini syntropic forests in the produce field, one section at a time. So we have 5 sections in total. And then the idea is that we plant the first section, we put the trees, the nuts, bushes, all of that in. The trees will be really small because we've grown them in the nursery. Because they're small, loads of light will be coming in. And so that's a really good spot to plant things like courgette, beans, tomatoes, oca, all of those lovely sunny crops. Next, we then plant another forest next to that in the next section. As the first section starts to develop a canopy and a little bit of shade develops, that's when we'll start to put things like salad crops in there, because they like the shade. And those sunny crops will move to the next forest planting. And then as a canopy develops even more in that first location and more shade, then we'll put brassicas and so on and so on and so on. But what that means is the produce field, the entirety of it, will be going through some form of forest regeneration at one point through different stages. And what I'm really excited about that is that different forms of forest regeneration means we're just going to have a huge explosion of biodiversity. That, you know, some animals will like open areas, some will like semi-shade, some will like deep shade. And basically it's going to allow us to cater to every bit of biodiversity that we have. And I'm really excited for that. And then when we want to start the process again, when all of it is forest, we're basically going to adopt a coppice regime into it. And we'll coppice sections of that forest, make it sunny again, start the process again, and so on and so on and so on.
Love it. It sounds amazing. I must come over. I must do one of your courses. It sounds fantastic. Please do. Yeah, I mean, God, you're doing such amazing work that's, you know, very groundbreaking still in this country, I think. People must go to your farm and just be utterly blown away by what they see, because it's still so alien to what we kind of get taught in terms of agriculture and horticulture. So hats off to you. You did an amazing job.
Yeah, and North Devon, where we are, is very intensively farmed. Like, it's very heavy dairy. Hedgerows are cut to the lowest that they can be cut, slurry, silage, and all of that. And actually, North Devon is really bad for deforestation. If you find a forest, 9 times out of 10, it's probably a pine plantation from the 70s and 50s. And so when we first started the farm, I remember standing in the field and there was nothing. You couldn't hear anything. There was no birds, no insects, nothing. But now when you come to the farm, there's like song thrushes, blackbirds, robins, blue tits, finches. There's so much life and noise and sound and movement that I think when people see it, they get so taken by it because it's so wild and lovely that we hope that a lot of people are inspired by that and want to try and do the same at home. And like I said, it's kind of complicated in the sense that it's not something that you can just like, oh, Monday I do this and Tuesday I do that. But from a grower, I've become a far better grower, and my guys are a lot better in growing because it's more like gardening. Like gardening is a very instinctive, kind of intuitive way of growing. Like, when to do something, you read the landscape. And I think that's kind of how it makes you as well. So, it's made me a far better grower as well for it.
Thank you very much to Joshua for sharing some of his obviously vast knowledge. And thanks to you, of course, for listening. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.